Hi there, welcome to this revision video for EdExcel GCSE History, Medicine in Britain, 1250 to present day. This video is going to talk about the British sector of the Western Front, 1914 to 1918, injuries, treatment and the trenches. This is the historic environment part of the exam, so really important. You know this one really well in terms of preparing for your exam. Okay, so that just outlines what the specification says in terms of what you need to know. So the key things are the context of the British sector of the Western Front, the theatre of the war in Flanders and northern France, the Ypres salient, the Somme, Arras and Cambrai, the trench system, its organisation, including frontline support trenches, and the significance for medical treatment of the nature of the terrain and problems of the transport and communications infrastructure. You need to know what conditions required medical treatment on the Western Front, including the problems of ill health arising from the trench environment, the nature of wounds from rifles and explosives, the problem of shrapnel, wound infection, increased number of head injuries, and the effects of gas attacks. You need to know about medical treatment on the Western Front, the work of the nurses, the transport in the chain of evacuation, stretcher bearers, horse and motor ambulances. Stages of treatment areas include in the chain of evacuation, first aid posts and field ambulances, dressing stations, casualty clearing stations and base hospitals, and also to know about the underground hospital at Arras. The significance of the Western Front for experiments in surgery and medicine, and new techniques in the treatment of wounds and infection, including the Thomas splint, the use of mobile X-ray units, the creation of a blood bank for the Battle of Cambrai. And you need to know about the historical context of medicine in the early 20th century, the understanding of infection, and moves towards aseptic surgery, and developments in the storage of blood. So there's quite a lot to know about in this topic, but we're going to break that down for you, and we're going to go through this in this revision video for you. As part of this content, you also need to know about historical sources that can be used for historical inquiries, so knowledge of national sources relevant to the period and issues such as army records, national newspapers, government reports and medical articles. Knowledge of any local sources relevant to the period and issues such as personal accounts, photographs, hospital records, army statistics. Recognise the strengths and weaknesses of different types of sources for specific inquiries, and framing of questions relevant to the pursuit of an inquiry, and selection of appropriate sources for specific investigations. And we'll have a look at some of that as well within this video. So we're going to begin by looking at the context of the British sector of the Western Front, and so let's find out a little bit more about this part of the course. Okay, so here's just a timeline of the First World War, and I think this is incredibly helpful just to have a timeline here, just to know some of the key dates, so you can kind of connect all the different stories and learning together. So the First World War began in August 1914. The first trenches for August to September 1914, both sides dug trenches, defended with barbed wire and machine guns, and we get this essentially stalemate situation on the Western Front. October to November 1914, the First Battle of Ypres, British troops stopped the Germans from capturing ports like Calais. In April-May 1915 is the Second Battle of Ypres, German attack using chlorine gas, 60,000 Allied casualties. The Battle of Verdun is February to December 1916. German forces attack French forces, 160,000 French soldiers killed. The Battle of the Somme takes place July to November 1916. There's 60,000 British casualties on the very first day of fighting, including 20,000 killed. The Battle of Arras is April to May 1917. Large-scale attack on German positions, very high casualties. The Third Battle of Ypres, the Battle of Passchendaele. The aim is to capture the Passchendaele Ridge near the town of Ypres. It was captured, but at the cost of 245,000 British casualties. November to December 1917, the Battle of Cambrai. The British Army used a large number of tanks to attack German trenches, 40,000 British casualties. Spring 1918, the German spring offensive. The German army launched a major attack along a 50-mile front. It was initially successful, but it led to 200,000 British casualties, but the German army did not achieve the decisive breakthrough. The end of the First World War was the 11th of November 1918, after the Allied armies, with US forces, broke through German lines. So you can see here, First World War, very brutal conflict, lots of casualties, and obviously we're going to look at the kind of medical history of that as part of this this video. Okay, so in Flanders and northern France, we had the Ypres salient, or wipers, as the British soldiers called it. Now, many battles took place here because it was on the way to the channel ports of Calais and Dunkirk. Germany wanted to capture these ports in order to cut off British supplies. Now, the Ypres salient was really vulnerable because the Germans had the higher ground and could see Allied movements. Tunnelling and mining were used by the British at Hill 60 to try to recapture it in April 1915. Now, Hill 60 was a man-made hill captured by the Germans. Now, the first Battle of Ypres, that took place in 1914, where the British held off a German attack. Germans were trying to, basically get a route through to Calais to stop the British being able to supply their forces. The second Battle of Ypres in April-May 1915 saw the first use of chlorine gas by Germany, and the third Battle of Ypres, sometimes known as the Battle of Passchendaele, took place from July to November 1917. So lots of fighting took place during the Ypres salient, and you can see there in that map at the bottom, which shows the first Battle of Ypres, there's this very distinctive kind of bulge in the front line here, which gives it the name the salient. So further south of Ypres is the Somme, and that's very famous, of course, for the Battle of the Somme, which took place between July and November 1916 along the River Somme in northern France. Now, on the first day, the 1st of July 1916, the British suffered 60,000 casualties, including 20,000 dead. It's the worst day in the history of the British Army. In total, there were around 400,000 casualties, putting enormous pressure on the medical services across the Western Front during this time period. Another key place where fighting took place was at a place called Arras. Okay, the Battle of Arras took place in April 1917, north of where the Battle of the Somme took place. Now, this is distinctive and remembered for Allied soldiers digging a network of tunnels below Arras. The tunnelling was easier due to the chalky ground, so new tunnels joined with existing tunnels, caves and quarries. There were even rooms that were created with running water and electricity. There was also an underground hospital located there that we're going to talk about a little bit more in the presentation. The tunnels were used for safety, enabled soldiers to walk to the front or get to the front line in secret. So that was the Battle of Arras. Okay, and then another place that's important in the Western Front is Cambrai. So the Battle of Cambrai took place in October 1917. During the battle, over 450 large-scale tanks were used by the Allies to launch a surprise assault on the German front line. The tanks did not have enough infantry support, so the British lost the ground they had taken. Okay, so as the First World War developed into a defensive war, a line of trenches was dug all along the Western Front. Now, the trenches were around 2.5 metres deep, and they were dug in a zigzag pattern for defence and contained dugouts for soldiers to take cover. Now, some key words and ideas to be aware of. The front line was the trench nearest the enemy where soldiers would fire from. This was by far the most dangerous part of the trenches to be in, and where most of the fighting obviously took place. The command trench would be about 10 to 20 metres behind that firing line from the front trench. Behind that would be a support trench, which is about 200 to 500 metres behind the front line. And that's where soldiers would be who could then support the front line trenches if need be. And the reserve trench was then 100 metres behind the support trench, and they would be there ready to mount a counter-attack if necessary if the enemy entered the front line. The communication trenches linked the front line with the command support and reserve trenches. And no man's land is the land between Allied and German trenches. And that's pretty much how the sort of trench system worked in the First World War. And soldiers would spend various amounts of time in different parts of the trenches, but would sometimes have some time behind the lines to sort of rest and recuperate. So, for example, at the Ypres salient, British soldiers would go back to the town of Ypres, for example, to sort of like rest and relax and rebuild their strength, then to go back onto the front line. So the trench system was really complex, and it made it really hard. The terrain of the trenches with all the mud, for example, made it really hard to move the wounded from trenches to hospitals. Moving through the trench system was really hard because it was so cramped and there were lots of men and equipment, so it could be very slow to get through the trenches, and communication was really difficult during major battles. Particularly hard to move around at night time, and collecting the wounded from no man's land was very difficult because it was mostly had to be done under fire. So people called stretcher bearers would have to go onto the battlefield with stretchers to try and rescue wounded men from the battlefield. No man's land and the trenches themselves were often deep in mud, making it practically impossible to move around, really. Stretcher bearers found it difficult to move around corners, and obviously the zigzag trench system made that really difficult as well. So all in all, the actual terrain, but also the way that the trenches were constructed made it really difficult to move wounded soldiers around. Okay, so we're now going to look at what conditions required medical treatment on the Western Front and the ill health from the trench environment. And also within this, we're going to look at the effect of gas attacks as well. Okay, so in terms of conditions requiring treatment on the Western Front, one of the conditions requiring treatment on the Western Front was called trench fever, or sometimes known as pyrexia. This was transmitted by body lice, or greybacks as the soldiers called them. It had flu-like symptoms, high temperature and severe headaches. Drug treatments that were tried, such as quinine and salvarsan, but they did not work. Passing an electric current through the affected area was also used. By 1918, the cause had been identified as lice. So this meant that the main way of tackling this disease was by tackling the lice. So it meant that clothes were disinfected and delousing stations were set up, bathhouses were used. Trench fever affected nearly 500,000 men on the Western Front. Another really nasty disease or condition was trench foot. This was caused by standing in mud and waterlogged trenches, and that led to painful foot swellings. Tight boots added to issues as they restricted blood flow. Gangrene would set in, for example. Treatments included keeping the feet clean and dry. In the worst cases, the foot might have to be amputated. So the prevention for this was through changing socks and keeping feet dry. Officers ordered that all men should have 3 pairs of socks. Some soldiers rubbed whale oil into their feet. Men were put into pairs. They could look after each other's feet, monitor each other's feet, and just take care of each other. During the winter of 1914-1915, 20,000 Allied men were affected. Now, trench foot was definitely worse at the start of the war, before the soldiers really got the kind of idea and approach of how to actually treat the condition of trench foot. Another condition was shell shock, which is a mental kind of condition, suffering the mental effects of the First World War. Pretty much akin to post-traumatic stress disorder, to be honest, PTSD. It's caused by the unbelievably stressful conditions on the Western Front. Symptoms would include things like tiredness, headaches, uncontrolled shaking, and a mental breakdown. The condition was not well understood during the war. Treatments involved rest, and some soldiers were sent to recover back in Britain. Now, historians believe that 80,000 British soldiers experienced some kind of shell shock. Some were accused of being cowards, with some soldiers even being shot at dawn when they had shell shock. Serious cases were labelled as NYDN, which stands for Not Yet Diagnosed Nervous. And of course, we would recognise this as combat stress disorder, or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, in the 21st century. So what kind of weapons of war and what kind of wounds did that create? Well, obviously rifles, the Lee Enfield standard issue rifle, for example, loaded from one cartridge case, which created automatic rapid fire rather than one bullet. The bullets had points on them, which caused them to do even more damage. So you're looking at lots of wounds and horrible kind of like injuries, and obviously those injuries, if they didn't kill the men, could obviously lead to horrible infections as well. Machine guns could fire 500 rounds a minute. That led to devastating attacks to soldiers attacking across no man's land. Bullets would damage organs, fracture bones, horrible head injuries, for example. Many soldiers would tragically be killed outright, and many left with the most devastating wounds. Sometimes they would succumb to those wounds in the sort of days and weeks afterwards. Sometimes, of course, they would be able to survive them. Artillery, the cannons which grew bigger and bigger and became more powerful, like the British howitzer, which could send 900 kilogram shells. A shell means explosives. There's continuous bombardment, which could last for weeks and sometimes months, and obviously they could do a lot of damage and kill soldiers outright. Shrapnel was what exploded mid-air above the enemy. So it was a hollow shell, hollow explosive filled with steel balls or lead with gunpowder and a timer fuse. It was used against troops advancing across no man's land, and shells targeted soldiers in the trenches as well. Now, these weapons also led to an increase in head injuries. So in 1915, as a standard issue, a steel helmet replaced the soft caps for soldiers, and helmets reduced head injuries by around 80%. So many soldiers had their lives saved by steel helmets. Gas attacks. So we've already found out that the first gas attack using chlorine gas was at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915. Gas was a new type of warfare in the First World War which spread much fear. In most cases, its effects, though, were short-lived and disappeared after a couple of weeks in the hospital. There were three main types of gas used in the First World War. Firstly, chlorine. This was used by the Germans in 1915 and led to death by suffocation. So in July 1915, gas masks were given to all British troops. Before this, soldiers would urinate on the handkerchiefs and hold these on their faces so as not to breathe in the gas. The ammonia in urine would offer a degree of protection against the gas, although it was nowhere near as effective as having a gas mask. Phosgene was first used by the Germans in 1915. It worked more quickly than chlorine but had similar effects. It could kill someone exposed to it within 2 days. And then mustard gas. This was first used by the Germans in 1917. An odourless gas that worked in 12 hours, caused blisters and could burn the skin through clothing. We're now going to look at medical treatment on the Western Front, and we are going to think about all the different things, including the underground hospital at Arras, which we've already mentioned. Okay, so in terms of treating the wounded on the Western Front, we had what was called the evacuation route. So how are we going to get these soldiers out of the trenches if they've been injured, maybe injured on the battlefield? So let's imagine a situation where a soldier is injured in no man's land. Maybe they've gone over the top in an attack like at the Battle of the Somme on the 1st of July 1916. So they've been injured, they're lying injured on the battlefield. So their treatment would kind of go through these different stages. So firstly, stretcher bearers. So these are soldiers. Often these could be sort of like non-combatant roles. These stretcher bearers will go onto no man's land at night or maybe during a lull in the fighting to collect both the dead and the wounded. Every battalion had a stretcher bearer, and it took 4 men to carry a stretcher, as you can see in that artistic interpretation. We then had the regimental aid post, or the RAP. And now the RAP was close to the front line. Each battalion had a regimental medical officer, and their job was to identify those who were lightly wounded and those soldiers who needed more medical attention. It was moved forward when casualties were expected in an attack. Okay, so from there would be the field ambulance and dressing station. Now, a field ambulance was a mobile medical unit with medical officers, support staff and nurses from 1915. Emergency treatment happened here, and they were about a mile from the front line. And this was where triage was set up to provide a little bit of treatment, and the more and the less seriously injured were separated out. From there, we have the Casualty Clearing Station, CCS. This was a large and well-equipped medical unit. It contained X-ray machines and wards with beds. They were located in tents or huts about 10 miles from the front line. It usually had 7 doctors with nurses and other staff. And then finally, we have the base hospital, which is usually a civilian hospital or a converted building near railways. Soldiers could arrive by train, ambulance, or even canal. They had operating theatres, X-ray departments, and specialist areas to deal with gas poisoning. From the base hospital, most casualties were sent back to Britain in converted hospital trains. Okay, so how did the treatment of the wounded change during the First World War? Well, soldiers generally received better care as the war went on, and that's not a surprise. You know, people got more experience in how to deal with the wounds, and the systems got a lot more sophisticated. In 1914, there were no motor ambulances, and horse-drawn ambulances could not cope with lots of casualties. But by November 1915, there were 250 motor ambulances in France. Ambulance trains were also introduced, and they could carry lots of casualties, up to about 800. And ambulance barges were used to carry casualties along the River Somme, which you can see a picture of there. Okay, let's talk about the underground hospital at Arras. So we've already found out that the chalky kind of atmosphere at Arras was really, really good for tunnelling. So 160,000 British and Australian soldiers were actually killed at the Battle of Arras, and in just the first 3 days, 7,000 were wounded. And the evacuation route worked well. In 1916, existing tunnels and quarries were extended to create almost like an underground town for soldiers that even had running water and electricity. It included a hospital with 700 beds and operating theatres. It was so large, a horse-drawn railway was used to move supplies. Okay, in terms of nurses and doctors, all medical officers and men in 1914 belonged to something called the RAMC, the Royal Army Medical Corps. Membership increased greatly during the war from 9,000 in 1914 to 113,000 in 1918. This was because there were so many more wounded. Doctors had to learn quickly about new conditions. At the start of the war, nurses were from the Queen Alexandra's nurses. Volunteer nurses were turned away, and women of the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, the FANY, also helped out as ambulance drivers and nurses. They also carried supplies to the front line and drove motorised kitchens to supply food. Okay, we're now going to look at the significance of the Western Front for experiments in surgery and medicine, new techniques including the Thomas splint, mobile X-ray units, and the creation of a blood bank for the Battle of Cambrai. So why did the Western Front improve medicine? That's a really good question. So there's quite a lot of evidence for this. Firstly, everyone in the medical service worked harder than they did in peacetime, so there's very much a sense of people pulling together and working together for a common goal. Also, the Western Front created new problems such as deep infections which needed urgent solutions. There was pressure on doctors to get men fit for service to return them to the front line. And industry and government gave resources to developing and improving medical and surgical equipment. Doctors had to innovate quickly to find new solutions created by powerful new weapons. Surgeons did many more operations, and that increased their experience and expertise. Okay, so in terms of treating wounds and infection, in 1900 most operations were carried out using what was called aseptic methods. So that was the idea of keeping the whole operating theatre clean. But this could not be done on the Western Front because all equipment had to be carried. This made it hard to treat infections such as those caused by gas gangrene. Other treatments were used, such as debridement, which means cutting away infected tissue around the wound. This had to be done quickly and the wound then closed to prevent infection. There was also the Carroll-Dakin method, which was when a sterilised salt solution was used in the wound through a tube or put into the wound through a tube. The solution, though, only lasted 6 hours, so it had to be made when needed, so it could be quite a slow process, the Carroll-Dakin method. And then, of course, there's amputation, which is a more extreme kind of form of treatment. This was used if the above did not work. By 1918, 240,000 men had actually lost limbs. Okay, the Thomas splint. Those with a gunshot or shrapnel injury had around a 20% survival chance, and this is because compound fractures were common. This is when the bone broke through the skin, and that massively increased the risk of infection. Now, doctors only had simple splints, which did not really stop the broken ends of bones, causing huge blood loss, which actually caused many soldiers to die. However, a Liverpool surgeon called Hugh Owen Thomas, which gives us the name of the Thomas splint, invented a new splint, and you can see a picture of it there. It was used from 1916 onwards. The Thomas splint was used, which kept the leg rigid and stopped the joints moving, and that lessened the concern about blood loss, and that increased the survival rate from this wound up to 82%. Now, X-rays were first discovered in 1895 by William Röntgen, a German physicist, and from 1896 radiology departments were opening a number of hospitals. X-rays enabled a surgeon to carry out a diagnosis before an operation took place. X-rays were used from 1914 to locate bullets and shrapnel, but they had to be removed from wounds. X-rays were a great success but did have some limitations. Firstly, X-rays could not detect all objects in the body, such as fragments of clothing could not be detected. Wounded soldiers had to remain really still, which was really difficult if they were in a lot of pain. And tubes in X-ray machines often overheated, meaning they could only be used for an hour before needing to be left to cool down. The solution was using 3 machines in rotation. Mobile X-ray units. So there were 6 mobile X-ray units in the British sector of the Western Front. They were transported around the Western Front in a truck, enabling more soldiers to quickly have their X-rays. The mobile X-ray machine could go to the location of a battle rather than waiting for soldiers to be transported. The quality of X-rays were not quite as good, but they were good enough to locate bullets and shrapnel. Okay, so blood transfusions and storage of blood. Now, blood loss was a major problem in surgery, and the first experiments on blood transfusion took place in the 19th century. Blood could not be stored, so it had to be used as soon as possible. Transfusions were carried out with the donor being directly connected by a tube to the recipient. Now, some problems with early blood transfusion were that blood clots as it leaves the body, so tubes often became blocked. Donor blood was sometimes rejected for not being compatible. Blood groups were only discovered in 1901 by Karl Landsteiner, and there was a danger of infection from unsterilised equipment. Now, blood transfusions were used at base hospitals from 1915, and this was extended to casualty clearing stations in 1917. A doctor called Geoffrey Keynes designed a portable blood transfusion kit which could be used close to the front line. Now, in 1915, it was discovered that sodium citrate could be added to the blood, which removed the need for donor-recipient transfusion. In 1916, it was discovered that adding a citrate glucose to blood enabled it to be stored for up to 4 weeks. So what we've got invented here is the idea of a blood bank and the fact that blood transfusions don't need the donor patient there at the same time. Stored blood was used at the Battle of Cambrai in 1917. There was a blood bank with blood stored in glass bottles. So that's all about the blood bank at Cambrai in 1917. Now, there were lots of head injuries in the First World War, so developments like blood transfusions and saline solutions had helped more people survive. And progress was made in brain surgery too. So a local anaesthetic was used rather than a general anaesthetic to decrease risks and stop the brain from swelling. Now, Henry Cushing developed a surgical magnet to extract bullets from head wounds. And X-rays also helped locate where the bullets were and also locate where injuries were within the brain. There's also huge developments in plastic surgery. So obviously lots of soldiers got facial wounds during the First World War. Now, Harold Gillies was a doctor from New Zealand, and he was sent to the Western Front in 1915. Now, Gillies became interested in facial reconstruction, restoring parts of the face that had been destroyed by weapons of war. Skin grafts were developed where skin was taken from another part of the patient's body and used to repair the wound. So in terms of historical sources, there are many different types of sources that can help us to find out about the British sector of the Western Front. There are National Army records for individual soldiers. National newspaper reports contained reports about different battles. So for example, the Times reporting on the Battle of the Somme in 1916. There's hospital records that have been kept, government reports on battles or aspects of the war, personal accounts of medical treatments by soldiers, doctors and nurses. There's even things like war poetry, for example. The army kept detailed statistics about people that were killed and injured and what injuries people had. Medical articles were written by doctors or nurses who took part in the war, and they were produced in things like the British Medical Journal. There's lots of photographs that exist from the Western Front, and also people wrote down their life stories in the forms of autobiographies. So when you're getting the question about thinking about what sources could be used to help answer a question, these are good sources just to have at the back of your mind that you could make specific reference to. Okay, so thanks for listening to that revision video for Medicine in Britain, 1250 to present day, looking at the British sector of the Western Front, 1914 to 1918, injuries, treatment and the trenches. Thank you very much and good luck with your exams.